Hello, everyone. So, I wanted to also go over a few things about introductions and conclusions and effective writing, because one of the things that I think is so important is the way that you're writing actually impacts the reader, right? What effect does it have on them? And so, an effective introduction actually hooks the reader in a way, and a conclusion fulfills the promise of that introduction and kind of gives the final punch to that, to the main idea there. So I am in general not a big fan of just the standard 5 paragraph essay format where you have an introduction that states your 3 main points, your thesis statement, those 3 points elaborated on, and then a conclusion that is pretty much just a repetition of the introduction. That doesn't necessarily have a profound impact upon the reader, because I mean, if the conclusion is exactly the same as the introduction, why is it there, right? So it shouldn't just be repetition unless that repetition serves a very particular emphasis or point to have an impact on the reader. And there are some essays that thrive on repetition, right? There's one, I may send it to you a little bit later just as an example. It's about poverty, right? And it keeps repeating the phrase, this is poverty, this is poverty, this is poverty. And it emphasizes like very disgusting details about smell and things like that. So it's effective in a way in its repetition, but if you don't have a reason for that repetition or kind of a rhetorical kind of strike to it really, then think about other ways that you can do it. And I can give you vague generalities, but I wanted to give you some specifics today. So these were two sample writing papers from my other classes. I'm just going to read the introduction. I'm actually going to read the whole papers, but I'm going to pause and talk about them after each point, because one of the topics that I gave you, the What's a True Friend one, as I already said, was something of a trap, right? Because it's very hard to do a good job on that one when you're just dealing in generalities. True friend is someone who believes in you, someone who's there for you, someone who's honest with you, someone who supports your decisions, right? Okay, so none of that did I have to think about for more than a split second before I pulled it out of the ether and regurgitated it, right? So how can you make your paper, because all those things are true, right? All those things are true. How can you make your paper compelling and interesting given that, right? The details are always going to be the same unless you bring up a specific anecdote, unless you start to think about, okay, how can I frame this in a way that someone has never thought about before? And so usually the most compelling ones, and they were the two that I chose, right, are the what are you scared of? Because everybody's a little bit different in their fears, and usually they can articulate those with personal stories and anecdotes in a way that sometimes some of the more general topics you have to work a little bit to get at. And so I do want to talk about the introductory strategy of this first sample paper that I'm going to read you. And like I say, this was written for my class this semester here. So let me pull that up. Okay. So what are you scared of? One. When I think of the word scared, I think about all the episodes of Scooby-Doo I used to watch as a kid growing up in the late 90s. I think about Shaggy and Scooby being scared of whatever monster or boogeyman they had to face that week while the gang solved the mystery. That's what left a lasting impression on me as a child when it came to being scared. At the end of the episode, movie, or just the end of the day, Shaggy and Scooby taught me it was okay to be scared sometimes, but to ultimately face my fears because they might not be as scary as I originally thought or expected. What am I scared of and why? I'm scared of lots of things. However, being scared is okay if I know it's only temporary until I face why. Okay, let me pause real quickly. That was the introductory paragraph. This is only 3 paragraphs, right? There's the introduction, the paragraph, the body paragraph, and then the conclusion here. So the body of this is not going to be about Scooby-Doo at all. This is an introductory strategy, and what is that show about? While it may not be the most sophisticated show in the world, it's about people who are terrified, facing seemingly supernatural situations, and then at the denouement or the end, you realize, right, when the mask is taken off, that it's not as frightening as it seemed to be. But that doesn't mean that the people involved, or the dog, right, are not scared to death, even though they can face those fears and confront them, and it doesn't stop them from eliminating the fear by the end. So real quickly, one thing I would change about this. I would set it up the same way with, hey, Scooby-Doo is about these frightened people. But I wouldn't say until the end, right, that when you pull off the mask of fear as they do, that it's revealed that it's maybe nothing to be afraid of at all. That's a good way to come back to it in the conclusion. So when I say the conclusion fulfills the promise of the introduction, here's a metaphor. Being afraid is like, the experience of being afraid is like Scooby-Doo. They're scared, right? They're facing their fears somehow, even though they're still frightened. And then the end, when you come back, it references it again. And the writer does reference it again. But let's go to the body paragraph, okay? So they're talking about fears. When I was growing up, I had an irrational fear of spiders. Looking back, the fear wasn't irrational to me until much later. I have a very clear memory of my first true interaction as a child with spiders. Picture being a child strapped into your car seat, looking out the window of the back seat of the car, right? Your grandmother and great aunt are taking you on an adventure to the grocery store. You become so excited, you've been kicking the seat slightly with your legs. Suddenly, you start to itch. You start feeling millions of tiny things crawling up your legs and all over your body. Upon further inspection, you realize you have tiny, almost translucent spiders crawling all over you. You cry and try to articulate what's going on to the adults in front of you, but they don't understand for much of the car ride until you all arrive at the store. Your adventure has instantly become a nightmare. That's what happened to me as a child. I was petrified of arachnids for the majority of my childhood and early adulthood. So that's what the essay is about. The fear is spiders. And it illustrates that through an anecdote, a terrifying story. If you've ever been strapped in somewhere and something is crawling on you, that's a disgusting feeling, right? And so it brings that to life. And then we come back to the conclusion here. As I grew older and further progressed into my teenage years, I forced myself not to shy away from creepy crawlies like spiders and other bugs whenever I had to be around them due to work, sports, gardening with my family, or simply hanging out with friends. Spiders were part of life, even if I'd rather never have to interact with them. Though I was still scared of them, I faced my fears of them as much as I could because in my mind, that's what my favorite scared crime fighters would do. If Scooby was scared and could still do it, so could I. I learned to deal with my fear of spiders by learning it was okay to be afraid. Not let that fear stop me from living my life to the fullest, right? So this conclusion does call back to the introduction in that sentence there. That's what I talk about when I say it fulfills the promise of the introduction. It's not just a repetition. It's about facing your fears and moving on. And I think that, you can complete that with that callback to the way that the mask is removed from fear. And it seems to be something that maybe you don't need to be afraid of going forward, even though your first instinct might be. So I think that was an interesting way, because is Scooby-Doo really scary? Not to an adult audience, right? And I don't think even to a very young audience. But it's a good way because the show is about supernatural fears. And so even that metaphor, comparing a fear to a children's program, right, more or less, I think is very effective here. And that's a way to not just repeat, I'm scared of spiders. Why? Because they're hairy. Because some of them can jump. Because they bite you. And then you repeat that in the conclusion. That doesn't do any of this. It says, hey, my show was about fear that I like to watch, and the people who are afraid could still face their fears. Then it expands on, this is a terrifying scenario that might justify my fear, and then this is me trying to get past it and moving on and still living my life. So I think that's very effective. The other one is also about fear, but it's a more traditional essay structure. So let me just go over that one real quickly, just as an example, okay? This is also about fear, as I said. As a baby, you're scared to leave your parents. As a child, you start getting scared of things that the world tells you to be scared of, such as the dark, snakes, and other normal things. As a teen, you start to find where your true fears lie, and in some cases try to face them. Fear is something we've known our whole lives, even if we try to escape it. There's always something there to be afraid of. As for myself, I'm scared of the dark, frogs, and failure. Okay, so here we have a setup where it talks about fear as an evolution that changes over time. When you're a child, you're scared to lose your parents, right? And then as you go on, there are other things that you're told to be scared of until finally you arrive to the individual fears that can define you as a person. And so there's the statement of them. Now, we're going to talk about transitions a little bit later. This talked about the fears. They're going to lead into the first fear. So each paragraph is about one of those fears. Let's see how that's explored. The darkness. It's been one of my greatest fears for as long as I can remember. It's not the actual darkness that causes me fear, but the possibilities of what's in it. Psychologists all over America say that being scared of the dark is more common than being scared of heights. Also, 11% of Americans' biggest fear is the dark, and there's a citation there. In a lit-up room, we rely on our vision to see what's going on, to see any harm. In the dark, our vision is dulled or even gone in some cases. If we were in harm's way, we wouldn't be able to see. We wouldn't be able to react appropriately. In my pastor's words, darkness is the absence of light. Without light, darkness begins to take over. As time passes, your eyes begin to adjust to the absence of light, but my fear of what might be in the dark takes over. I really don't understand where this fear began, but I know it's real for me. Okay, so they used some quotes there, right? Some figurative language about darkness to explain it. Let's see how they transition from darkness to frogs, because there could be like a big gap there if we just like, oh, and frogs, right? So let's see how they do the transition. One thing I'd be scared of in the dark or in the light is frogs. So they kind of call back to that darkness there in the transition. This fear I can't explain. I don't know why I'm terrified of frogs. Maybe it's their quick hops, their croaking sounds. They look like a dinosaur that was left over after extinction. Slimy, nasty, fly-eating, ribbit-making animals are not my favorites. Frogs honestly have no place on Earth. They could be aliens for all we know. Rhinidophobia is the fear of frogs, and I definitely suffer from rhinidophobia. At work, a lifeguard at a pool, I check the skimmers, test the water, and other pool maintenance before guests arrive. One day I had to scoop frogs out of the skimmer, which was traumatic enough. But that was not the end of that terrible scenario. Just before pool guests arrived, I began to open the sun umbrella over the guard's chair. As I opened it, a frog jumped out and fell on my cup. I almost needed someone to rescue me, the lifeguard. So that's the second body paragraph. It tells an anecdote and a story, and it gives that bit of vocabulary interest for rhinidophobia, right? And it's also a citation there. So there's multiple strategies they're expanding on this, and it's bringing that to life in a story. And then we get the transition to the final point. And even though there's not much of a transition here, you don't always need a solid transition. Sometimes it just flows there. As a child, my parents would always tell me to do my best. As I got older, I feared that my best wouldn't always be good enough. All through my life, when someone asked me what was one of my long-term goals, I would always say to succeed. In order for me to succeed, it means I did more than my best. I didn't fail. I'm scared of failure at school, my work, and even in my family. If I fail myself, that also means I failed the people around me, and that scares me even more than failing myself. And then we get to the conclusion here. These fears, darkness, frogs, and failure, are real to me. However, they shouldn't control me or my daily life. In church, I've heard preachers say there are 365 fear nots or do not be afraids in the Bible. That means there's one for every day. I try to choose to live my life with faith, not fear. It's not always an easy task to complete living in fear. However, I choose not to give up. Okay, so this introduction and conclusion are not necessarily as related, but there's still a progression, because the introduction was, as you age, right, your fears change and the kinds of fears. Well, this conclusion is going forward, right? I choose faith going forward, and that there's some indication that you should not be afraid of these things, because there is a sense of faith that things are going to be okay even if you do have these fears here. So the strategies that were used to develop each individual point were good strategies. The transitions were pretty decent, right? And the introductory and concluding strategy, even though this is more like the traditional 5-paragraph essay, this was an effective way to do that. And the conclusion was not just a rote repetition. It was like a continuation of the introduction. As you grew through your phases of life, this is what fear was. As you go forward, you don't need to be afraid because you have faith, right? And so I think it still fits, but it's a little bit distinct. So try to think of interesting ways that you can make your introduction and conclusion have an impact, right? Have an impact on the reader there, so that they're left feeling a sense of fulfillment, that you did what you said you were going to do, that you fulfilled the promise of that essay. That doesn't mean you have to solve every world problem, but it does mean that if you set up something, whether that be a question, an interesting scenario, something like that, right? You touch on it briefly, fulfill it, continue it, answer the question, do something that gives a sense of completion for the conclusion there. All right, so I just wanted to give you those specific examples that you can think about as you write your paper one, that narrative essay there. If there's any questions or concerns, please contact me over email.